Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Cloud Show. As usual, we always have a good guest, and today we have a great one. We have Annie Talvasto with us today. She is a CNCF ambassador. That means Cloud Native Computing Foundation. She is a Microsoft MVP, and she is the CMO of VSHN. I do not know what that is. We'll ask her. So today the topic is going to be cloud compute hosting options and when to use Kubernetes. Annie is really good with Kubernetes. When to use it and when to not. When do you use a PaaS service instead? So thank you for joining us today on the Cloud Show. Hello, Annie.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah, good to see you. So you are all over the place. You are from Finland, but you live in Switzerland and various things. What's going on?
Yeah, I live in Zurich, Switzerland for 2 years now, so relatively fresh face in these corners. But I do speak a lot around the world. During 2022, for example, I did 30 conferences all the way from America to Australia to Japan and whatnot. So it's a bit of travel, yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And you keep yourself busy with CNCF, with being an MVP, being in the community, speaking, all those things. But you also have a day job. What's VSHN?
Yeah, it's pronounced vision. So just like, kind of, yeah, all in one go. So it is one of the leading companies in Switzerland for DevOps. So we have both services and products around DevOps, Kubernetes, containers, OpenShift, all of these things. I am the CMO there, so I handle marketing, but I am very much a coder and technical person at heart, which I think you have to be if you are working with DevOps topics full time. So yeah.
I agree with that. So, and I know that you can deal with all the things DevOps, obviously, and plenty with Kubernetes, which is the reason actually that I wanted to talk to you. Or, when I said I want to talk to Annie, what should we talk about? It was like Kubernetes was like the first thing that came up. You're happy to go with that?
Yeah, of course. Kubernetes is one of my favorite topics in the world.
So, pointed question to start off, of course. I see a lot of companies start to use containerized applications and setting up clusters and running their clusters, maybe running them in the cloud and so forth, and then finding that they are very challenged with actually maintaining that, securing it, updating it, keeping it up, just keeping it, the upkeep, the operations. So is it true that a lot of companies are going to containers because they should be going to containers, not because they actually know what they're doing?
I think that's a good and a challenging question. And I think the answer is, well, it's yes and no at the same time. Because I think Kubernetes and containers, Kubernetes in particular and containers as well, is one of those technologies that, you can essentially use them for any use case and it wouldn't technically be wrong. But at the same time, do you need it? Might be more of a relevant question in some cases. Because Kubernetes, for example, really is built for scale. It's really built for all of those like scaling cases. It is container orchestration because it is about managing a bunch of containers very efficiently at the same go. So then usually the first question that you can ask yourself, do I need Kubernetes for this case, is that do you have the scale that warrants it? If you want to do a practice round, of course, go ahead, host your personal block there. Maybe wouldn't recommend it, but you can go crazy.
You can do that.
Yeah, exactly. But obviously, after you answer the question of like, do I use Kubernetes? And if the answer is yes, then you have to go to the question of, how do I use Kubernetes? Which I think it's even more of a bigger question in some cases because it is a bit of a tricky thing to do, tricky to use, and there's so many things that you can do with it. So yeah, a lot of questions there.
I know. So with something as technically, capable and rather advanced, such as Kubernetes, running your own clusters and all those things, with that comes quite a bit of responsibility. You want a lot of power, then you have a lot of responsibility.
Yeah.
And as the expression goes. So I've been saying that for the application developer who builds an application and hosts it somewhere, Kubernetes and containers and all that, good stuff, it's like a platform service for the application developer. They just put their application somewhere and it runs. But that is still not really the case for the IT operations team that take care of that environment. It's more than that for them. It's more of for me, that becomes more of an infrastructure service. We're taking care of a cluster. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense in a lot of ways. And I think particularly it's interesting that you bring up the platform word or concept as a whole, because that is very much a trend word in the world of cloud native and Kubernetes. It is, because it is actually, I think it's not even just a trend word. It is kind of like the next iteration of how we think about how you enroll your company or how you use Kubernetes in an efficient way, for example. So platform engineering as a whole, and thinking about your Kubernetes infrastructure or your, DevOps infrastructure and all of these kind of things as a internal development or developer platform is taking the world by the storm. It is still like relatively not early phases per se. There's a lot of material, a lot of discussion around this. But let's say that I think the most traditional companies might not be, thinking in these terms yet as of right now. So I think that is a very good take in my opinion as well, because you're thinking about it holistically and you're thinking about, okay, we have these people who are managing this and that's really important. But then for the end user, which would be the developers in the company, for example, it should be as easy to use and no brainer as possible.
Like any platform.
Yeah.
Because then I work with some public sector customers right now, and they come from a non-cloud world, and that world is and has always been in a place where we're going to run a new application, so we have to order a new server, right? A virtual machine in these days, but sometimes you actually have to get new hardware because it's specific hardware and so on. So that's sort of that mindset. And on the other end of the scale is the mindset that I don't care where it runs, just run the thing. I'm expecting it to run. I'm expecting it to have a certain capacity, and that's just dealt with. Thank you very much. So on that spectrum, where Kubernetes, is that in the middle? Is it a little bit of both because you manage more, but it's still a platform service? I'm making weird gestures.
No worries, it's kind of fun. Little sock puppets at the end. Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question. And to be frank, I think it's in the way that, okay, Kubernetes itself is very tricky to use, and to expect your end users always to use Kubernetes as it is, it's just not going to happen. Like I nowadays, in addition to the traditional software engineering, DevOps and whatnot, I talk a lot about MLOps as well, and in particularly in those kind of cases, expecting for data scientists, for example, who are developing AI models to have knowledge of Kubernetes, they probably need some, but it's you have to pick your battles and so forth. So you have to choose it. But at the same time, for a fully fledged like internal developer platform, development platform, cloud native platform, or one of these, you would usually have a bit more than Kubernetes as well in the mix. So you would have Kubernetes likely as the base of it in some ways. And then you would have a lot of the, for example, CNCF add-ons from there. So you would likely use, if you need auto-scaling, you would use Kada. If you need GitOps, then you have Flux, Argo CD, all of these different options. So that's why also I think the platform term is getting so much widespread attention, because it actually encompasses the fact that it's just not just Kubernetes. There's a host of other things there, which can also, use productivity tooling as well, and all of these kind of things, in addition to, more traditionally viewed CNCF projects that are like, Kubernetes add-ons as well.
Yeah, good point. And so a couple of things spring to mind here. One is that Microsoft is, for example, not telling us exactly how they are building the higher level services that I like to call them, the services that we are seeing now in AI and ML. All of those are built with a lot of building blocks. You have storage, you have messaging, you have all kinds of things, data ingestion, pipelines, and things, and of course compute. So I'm sure that Microsoft are running a bunch of automated scalable clusters and containerizing the execution of various algorithms that you want to run as an ML, as a data scientist, right? I'm sure they're doing that. I'm sure they're using it a lot, but they're not telling us exactly how they're doing it. But
Exactly.
that's the thing that achieve this massive scale.
Exactly, and it's true. Like ChatGPT, OpenAI, there is a KubeCon keynote a few years back as well, where they've talked about how they use Kubernetes and how they, utilize these platforms. So
Okay.
that is an interesting point to start digging into. And there's CNCF like project additions there. So ML like Kubeflow, for example, for
Yeah.
managing all of those things where you need to have a self-service way for data scientists, for example, using these. But there's so many of them. There's over like 150 or something, from CNCF that you can tap into. So there's so many things that you can select. But obviously, keeping in mind always that not just run into random projects just because they're cool, even though I love cool projects and I'm the one who's always like, this is cool, this is cool, this is cool. But at the same time, think about what your application, what your infrastructure, what they actually need, what is truly needed for you, because you don't also want to add complexity just because that's never going to end really well either.
Yeah. A very, very good point. So, the other thing that I thought about from what you said before is you said that it's that there's some parts of running Kubernetes that are highly advanced and you can do very good things with it. So don't get me wrong. I mean, it's great, except that you have to be able to be on top of these things. What would you say are the biggest challenges for a company that wants to or are considering running something like Kubernetes? Oh, the technical people are coming to the manager saying, we're going to use Kubernetes, we're going to run our clusters. Managers don't know what that is. So what are the biggest concerns that they should be, or the company should be focusing on now? What's going to be the hardest?
Yeah, and there's actually, I think there's it depends on the maturity level of your company and like as far as cloud native and cloud use to begin with goes, and as well as the technical knowledge within your teams. But I think for me, as a kind of Kubernetes and cloud native CNCF enthusiast, I'm very deep in Kubernetes topics constantly, but it always surprises me, and I think it shouldn't really surprise me that how much actually people still need sometimes relatively quote unquote basic information and knowledge on Kubernetes. But so CNCF does a survey every year where they look into what are the trends around these usages around Kubernetes, cloud native projects, and whatnot, and what are to me, the most interesting part, what are the challenges that people are actually facing using these products. And
Yeah.
for years now, there's essentially been two, I think, in the really like high up, either the number 1 and 2 or like relatively there, has been knowledge and tooling, like knowledge, essentially education on how to use Kubernetes in the right way, because it is complex, as you said. And then the second one, which is rising, I think, every year, security. So that's another side that I think is very much
Yeah.
becoming, as well as has become, a big topic, and I think will rise in popularity and importance as we go on. But I do want to give a shout out. They actually, I think, released one of the new state of CNCF and community surveys like today. I haven't had the time to check it yet, so I have no hot off the press news. But like as a tip for everyone, that if you're interested, these are kind of being published all the time. Well, once a year, but there's different areas that you can check into. There's FinOps, there's security and whatnot.
Mhm.
So highly recommend checking these out if you're looking for, I think, peer support on, are you alone with your struggles, for example?
Okay, cool. So that's great. Now, the sweet spot of using Kubernetes. I'm assuming you're going to go with something like when it's automated, when you use DevOps and things, and that's okay. You can go with your baby. Like you can go with what your company does and so forth, right? So when you really are in the flow, when you're in the zone, how good is it? What is that you're doing right when you're doing it the right way? Like, ooh, sweet spot.
Well, I think for me, at least with technology, with any technology,
Yeah,
both with these and as well as anything, if things work, I'm happy.
yeah,
Like that's kind of the minimum requirement and also the best case scenario, which is funny to kind of say, but
yeah.
I think that's kind of what it is. And obviously, like we can go into making things super optimized, and I do actually talk about that as well. And then I think that should be considered for sustainability and cost optimization is a topic as well. But I think if those are hardwired into your requirements on what your platform and your Kubernetes usage should be like, so cost effective or sustainability, then that should be included in the it works, requirement.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that is the requirement. And I think no one who uses Kubernetes is no stranger to, battling some weird error codes here and there and but trying to figure out bugs and everything. But it's, as I said, if it works, it works and I'm happy then. So that's it for me at least.
That's it for you. Okay, so you don't have. I mean, I guess that's a movable goalpost, right? Once you have figured some things out, there's always something new to optimize or change and so forth. I guess.
Yeah, and I think it's because I am a big proponent for essentially like what makes sense for your infrastructure, your company, and your situation. Like people, if I so for example, I speak a lot about CADA, which is auto scaling, which I think it makes sense. Like just from a very like logical standpoint, auto scaling. So like you're saving money, you're saving environment like resources as well. You're saving time. You don't have to do things manually. It all makes sense. But a lot of times after I speak about it, people might come up to me after the conferences and talk about, oh, for these and these reasons, we couldn't use it. And they look a bit sad. And I'm like, well, it's fine. Like you had your reasons. It makes sense. I think it's fine. No one has to force themselves to use it if it doesn't make sense for their use case for a variety of reasons. So, and I think that you just have to kind of, deal with that as well. So it is very much a movable goalpost. So you can figure out what works for you in terms of what actually means it works for me.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So I guess I don't want to, end on a note that says that you shouldn't use Kubernetes, but what are some cases where people are just they're getting in over their head? I mean, they shouldn't really be doing this. You were saying the scale thing initially, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have that scale, then why are you using Kubernetes? You should be using a web app, right? Right? Is that like the only reason to not, go for this, highly capable and advanced machinery?
I do honestly think that scale is often the root cause for these scenarios.
Yeah.
Because particularly from the level of like, Kubernetes is built for scale. So if you're not managing that scale, it's going to be a bit complex for you to use. But again, if you want to learn it, if you want to use it, I'm not going to stop you. But at the same time, if like it's the same as like, okay, if you're sweeping with the broom, like you're sweeping with the broom, it's working. Do you need to have 100 brooms at the same time working if you just need one broom to sweep your house? No, you don't.
Yeah.
So yeah, so these are one of the reasons, and obviously that because that brings all the scale, like the
Yeah.
scale means that it brings the complexity, and it means a lot of different managing issues and everything. So then you're kind of creating more issues for yourself than you're solving necessarily. But then you have obviously levels to it. So you can start using Kubernetes relatively nowadays quite easily with AKS, EKS, one of these. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who I talk to who use Kubernetes, but then they might say that, oh, kubeflow itself was a bit too added a bit too much complexity to our ML AI scenario. But Kubernetes is a good backend and infrastructure that they can use. And I think that's also like the other level. Like, yes, sure, you can use Kubernetes for the scale that you have, which might be the threshold that you might meet quite easily. But then we're thinking about, Kubeflow or any of these like add-ons from, Argo CD, GitOps, whatnot, or any of these sites. Some people need multiple different type of service meshes. Would I recommend it? Not necessarily, but if you do, then you might need to plug in Meshery, which is a service mesh management plane. So then you get into these situations where to solve for the scale or complexities that your application brings, you're essentially adding more complexity, which makes sense. But also, if you don't fundamentally need these services, you're just adding complexity for the sake of complexity and will probably run into some issues down the road.
Yeah, definitely. So you're an Azure gal, same as I'm an Azure guy. We have that in common. So what would you be calling out in terms of other services that are like your favorite services to use together with your cluster? Is it stuff like, application insights, and what else commonly goes with a Kubernetes deployment?
Well, I think there's too many to mention. And as an Azure MVP, this is honestly the most stressful. Exactly. This is the most stressful question for me because I feel like I want to mention everything, but then I'm like, I don't know. Yeah, but it depends on your use case. Like I'm nowadays playing around a lot with Azure AI services as well and OpenAI connections there and everything. Mostly because that's kind of where my demos are, for example, at the moment. But there's so many, and to be frank, like I think, and Vision as well, we offer a lot of cost optimization services. So from that side, actually just, basic billing help and, advising services,
Yeah.
are actually really useful that I think people overlook quite often
Yeah.
for basic management. And to be also honest, policies are a
Yeah.
big one that people quite often overlook, both for security
Yeah.
and for costs as well, and for like sustainability. So
Yeah.
I do like a lot of these that are built in Azure
Yeah.
as well.
So you have to measure, same as with everything else. You need to measure your cost. You need to measure, well, I mean, to monitor if you are secure, and you need to measure how much usage you have in your cluster and so forth. All right, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I think that's it for time for this episode, and I think it was a really, really good one. I think it's a strong, walkthrough of how does this even work? What should you be thinking about? And I guess security and automation and scaling, I guess,
Yeah.
are like the big ones.
These are big ones, yeah. And I think it's always depends on the, I keep saying it depends on the scenario, but it really does. So
It
it's the right
depends.
answer. But it
It's
is,
the
it
favorite
is.
answer from any consultant.
Yeah, it is. But I do think you can really see, for example, the need for auto scaling from how fast Kata has moved. Well, it's always relative, but Kata has gone from like a sandbox to graduated project, for example, relatively fast. And you can see that people are really using it, loving it, and so forth. Or to be honest, there's obviously the cluster auto scaler and all of these things as well. But these are a lot of use case scenarios for Kubernetes because it's built for
Mhm.
scale. So then auto scaling really helps with a lot of the cases.
Yeah.
And I think, security is a big one as well. And we really do have to pay attention to
Yeah.
it.
And so the trend is to work towards getting to a place where your Kubernetes scenario feels like a platform service scenario. That's what you want to get to. You shouldn't be thinking about that other stuff so much.
Exactly. That is the trend currently, and it is gaining traction constantly. And you can see it in KubeCon programs. You can see it in the way people talk about these things.
Mhm.
There's so many good resources around that as well, and so forth. So there's a lot to dive deeper into there as well, if anyone's interested.
Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so much, Annie, for being on the show today. And thank you, everyone who was watching the Cloud Show. And I'll see you again next week.
Thank you for having me.